Just after 10 a.m. last Wednesday, students at Apalachee High School were sitting in class when they heard gunshots. Teachers got notifications of a lockdown. Students rushed to take cover in corners or crammed into closets. Police evacuated kids and teachers through the hallways. Hours later, law enforcement confirmed that 2 students and 2 teachers were killed. The alleged shooter was a 14-year-old, a student named Colt Gray, who brought an AR-15-style gun to school.
Since then, he's been charged with 4 counts of homicide, and his father has also been charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder, 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, and those amount to the most serious charges that have ever been filed against the parent of a school shooter.
That is John Woodrow Cox. He's a reporter at The Post, and he covers school gun violence. In the aftermath of this shooting, those charges filed against the father are what has really struck John.
I mean, there is no precedent for charging the parent of a school shooter with murder. That requires a level of intention that, most legal experts I've talked to think will be hard to prove. Also, the speed with which they filed these charges is extraordinary. That has never happened. 36 hours for charges this serious. That suggests that they have extremely compelling evidence against the father.
From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Monday, September 9th. Today, the swift charges against the 14-year-old's father, Colin Gray, aren't just surprising. They mark a cultural shift on how law enforcement thinks about school shootings. We will unpack how we got to this moment and how the high-profile prosecution of a school shooter's parents set us on this path. Just a warning, this episode will include some profanity and descriptions of violence. So, John, help me understand how exactly this horrible event happened. What do we know about this suspected shooter, this 14-year-old?
We know there were a lot of warning signs. We know that dating back a year ago, this was May of 2023, the FBI received anonymous tips about someone on a Discord channel who was threatening to shoot up a school. The FBI took that very seriously. They alerted the local sheriff's office because they had traced it to the 14-year-old boy who is now accused in the Apalachee shooting. They had a local sheriff's office go out and interview his father, interview the boy. The dad acknowledged that he had hunting rifles. He said that his son did not have, quote, unfettered access to those guns, and the boy denied having made those threats.
And I think that we have a little bit of tape from that interview between the police and this 14-year-old's father. So let's listen to some of that.
So he's been doing really good. Yeah. Like, in the beginning, he kind of struggled a little bit. Yeah. But
let me ask you this: do you have weapons in the house?
I do.
Are they accessible to him?
They are. I mean, there's nothing loaded, but they are down.
Okay.
We do a lot of shooting. We do a lot of deer hunting. He shot his first deer this year.
Yeah. Okay.
So
that is part of the interview. And then they go on to talk about the threats.
Like, I don't know. I don't know anything about him saying shit like that, and I'm going to be mad as hell if he did. And then all the guns will go away. Yeah. And they won't be accessible to him. I'm trying to be honest with you, I'm trying to teach him about firearms and safety and how to do it all and get him interested in the outdoors. Mm-hmm. Like on my phone.
Get him away from those video games.
Exactly right. That's the God honest truth. And the picture on my phone is him with blood on his cheeks from shooting his first deer. It was just the greatest day ever. Yeah, so sure. He knows the seriousness of weapons and what they can do and how to use them and not use them. So it's kind of a little bit of a shock. So in whatever y'all are telling him, please instill in him that if this is whatever or wherever this is coming from, it's no joke.
No.
Like, it's no joke.
Well, we wouldn't be here if it was.
No, I know. And I'm telling you right now, we talk about it quite a bit. all the school shootings, things that happen.
Yeah,
Hey,
scary.
are you getting picked on at school? He is. He's getting picked on at school, and is everything okay? That's why I keep going up there.
Yeah.
Because you never really know, and I don't want anything to happen to him. So,
I don't know how to describe that other than chilling, considering the fact that this was a conversation that they were having a year ago, and knowing what happened last week. John, I wonder what you made of hearing this interview.
I have a few immediate thoughts. One is there's this suggestion that he's educating his child, and that is somehow a protective measure that will prevent him from committing an act of violence or taking his own life. We've known for years. The data has bared this out. The research has showed us for so long, you cannot educate a child out of making a bad choice with a firearm. You can't do it. Their aptitude with the gun does not dictate whether or not they will kill themselves or they will kill someone else. A human's brain does not fully develop until they're in their mid-20s. So the idea that you could trust a 14-year-old with a weapon that is not dissimilar to what people use in war zones is just not based in reality.
Well, I want to talk a lot more about the role of the dad in all this. But before we get there, I do want to talk about law enforcement here. And I think some people who hear this tape might rightfully ask, wait, if the FBI was involved a year ago or had warnings about this, why didn't law enforcement intervene in some way? Why didn't they find a way to prevent this shooting from happening if this child was on their radar?
So there's sort of two, I think, ways to think about that. Certainly some of the experts that I've talked to said that, there's only so much law enforcement can do in that situation, that, maybe they could have taken the step of getting a mental health expert involved. That's something that perhaps they could have done at that stage rather than just purely reacting through a criminal justice lens. They did say that they alerted the local schools. Whether this school was alerted is not something that I know for sure, whether they alerted Apalachee, which is where he eventually attended, right? He went from a middle school to a high school. So, I think we don't know enough to know why they didn't do more, why they stopped at the point that they did. We know that there are hundreds, thousands of threats, right? These threats are constant. It is hard.
And how do you know which ones are serious,
right,
which ones aren't, which ones are pranks?
Right. Exactly. Now, I will say, for the FBI to take that step is very unusual. That is not standard practice. So that suggests that they were taking this seriously, that, they said to the local law enforcement, you need to go out and chase this down. And it just perhaps stopped short.
So then we come back to the parents. And I do want to acknowledge here some reporting from our colleague, Sarah Blasky, about the shooter's mother, who apparently told family members that she called the school on the morning of the shooting and warned a counselor about a, quote, extreme emergency involving her son. And that's according to text messages obtained by the Post in an interview with a family member. We also have a lot of reporting about the family being in contact about this kid's mental health, that a relative was told that he was having homicidal and suicidal thoughts. And so that's important to understand. But then we come back to the father, who has now been charged with murder. Can you explain more about the charges and how prosecutors are thinking about this decision to hold him responsible?
Yeah, so the charges have understandably have confused a lot of people, because there's sort of two layers of charges. So the first and the most serious are second-degree murder, and there's two of those. And it's instead of four, right? So 4 people have been killed, of course, but there were 2 children killed. And the reason it's just 2 charges of murder is because it's sort of a uniqueness in Georgia law that says it requires to prove a, quote, negligent cruelty to a child to convict on that second-degree murder charge. There are charges behind that. There are 4 charges. These are lesser charges of involuntary manslaughter. And a legal expert gave me a perfect hypothetical to understand the difference. So let's say an adult has a party at their home. They have minors who are at that house. They serve alcohol to those minors. One of them takes a car, goes out and kills someone or themselves. A prosecutor could argue in that case that that is involuntary manslaughter, that that adult is guilty of involuntary manslaughter. Another scenario is same minor at the house, and the adult gives that minor alcohol until that child dies of alcohol poisoning. That is something that could qualify as second-degree murder in the state of Georgia with this idea of negligent cruelty to a child. So I thought that was sort of a helpful way to understand the difference between these two charges. There's a sort of an increased level of negligence that they're going to have to prove in Georgia if they're going to convict Colin Gray of second-degree murder. If this case goes to trial, jurors will have the option. They can either convict him of the counts of murder, or they can acquit him on those and then convict him on 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter.
After the break, John and I talk about the convictions earlier this year in Michigan that opened the door to criminal prosecution of the parents of school shooters. We'll be right back. So, John, you said that there's no precedent for charging the parents of a school shooter or a child shooter with murder. But there is precedent for bringing charges, period, against parents. Talk a little bit about how the legal world has started to move in this direction and the case that you covered in which similar charges played out in the courts.
Yeah, so really the watershed moment on this issue was in the winter of 2021, the end of 2021. There was a shooting at Oxford High School in Michigan. A 15-year-old there had been gifted a 9mm by his parents. Just a few days earlier, his mom had taken him to a gun range. The morning of the shooting, he had written on a math worksheet a dead body, someone who'd been shot dead. He wrote, "The world is dead, help me." His parents were called to the school. They declined to take him home. They said, we're busy with work. And hours later, he opened fires in the school and kills 4 students. Karen McDonald, the prosecutor there, this is in a suburb of Detroit, took the unprecedented step of charging those parents with involuntary manslaughter. They were the first parents to ever be charged with a homicide. And, that case played out over, more than 2 years. I embedded with the prosecution there for the entirety of that case. And earlier this year, in 2 separate trials, both parents were convicted of those charges and sentenced to the maximum allowed by Michigan law. It was 10 to 15 years in prison.
Mr. Crumley, it's clear to this court that because of you, there was unfettered access to a gun or guns, as well as ammunition in your home. You characterized yourself as a martyr and threatened the well-being of the prosecutor. Mrs. Crumley, you glorified the use and possession of these weapons. Your attitude toward your son and his behaviors was dispassionate and apathetic. Your response to school staff after a 12-minute meeting was, "Are we done here?"
So that set a precedent. And the way that one legal expert described it to me, he called it a psychological breakthrough for other prosecutors.
What do you mean by that?
The legal system is built on precedent, right? That everybody wants something else to point to. Karen McDonald did not have something else to point to, but now they do. And it provides them a layer of cover, is they can say, well, I'm not the first to do this. This isn't novel. I'm not taking this step before someone else has. And 2, it's not that someone's just charged. They got a conviction. They got a maximum sentence. So it was as successful as it possibly could have been. And so if you're the prosecutor in Georgia, you can point to that and say, I'm not sticking my neck out as far as I would have if I didn't have those prosecutions to point to.
So this case in Michigan has helped other prosecutors have this as an option of charging the parents of juvenile shooters. But Tell me about why prosecutors are more interested in pursuing this avenue, why they've been paying attention to these kinds of legal cases.
Yeah, I've been writing about this particular issue since 2018. The first story I wrote about it was in rural Kentucky. There was a kid there who had gotten his stepfather's gun. He just walked into his parents' room. He opened the closet, took out a gun, a bunch of ammunition. He goes to school and he shot 16 students. He killed 2 of them. The prosecutor there, and this was in a deep red, very pro Second Amendment part of Western Kentucky, the prosecutor there floated the idea of seeking an indictment against the stepfather. And ultimately he decided that he couldn't find a law that fit, but there was enormous pushback there in the community. People were really uncomfortable with this idea. And it really was because, as one guy explained to me, if you put 12 people on a jury in this case, several of them would say, well, I've got a gun that's unlocked at home. It might be loaded. What if my kid takes that gun and shoots somebody? Mm-hmm. Am I going to be charged with a crime? So this is 6 years ago. And that was in a very similar community to Georgia. Something's changed. And I talked to the prosecutor there, that Kentucky prosecutor, over the weekend. He ended up losing the next election. And he thinks it was because he floated this idea of charging a parent. He just thinks that people are fed up. And regardless of their political stripes, regardless of whether they're gun owners or NRA members, he thinks they are simply fed up. After the Oxford shooting in Michigan, there was a poll done about 6 months later of Michigan residents, and they asked them, among many other questions, whether or not they supported some form of a safe storage law, something that basically mandated that gun owners had to lock up their weapons, keep their guns from falling into the hands of children. And the results were really fascinating. Among gun owners, 76% said that they supported that law. 3/4 of Republicans said they supported that law. And most remarkably to me, nearly 2/3 of NRA members in Michigan said they supported that law.
Well, it seems to me like there's such a palpable frustration from so many Americans on, as you said, both sides of the political aisle about the situation with school shootings, and a sense of horror and dismay at how it seems like there's nothing to be done, right? That we're at this moment where talking about gun control is a political non-starter, and gun legislation is very slow to change if it ever does, but that when it comes to this idea of, well, at least you could hold the parents responsible, that's something that prosecutors actually have the power to do right now. And this is like a tool that you can use that is actually some form of action.
I think that's exactly it, right? I think that we're seeing new approaches to addressing this issue, because I think large populations in this country have given up on Capitol Hill. They've given up on their own state legislatures. So they're taking different tactics. The other sort of front that this is being fought on is in the civil court system, that parents are going and winning against gun manufacturers. And I think what you said is exactly right, is there is a deep frustration that nothing's being done, that nobody's being held accountable. And you have allegations here of egregious neglect in both cases, and prosecutors who are just saying, this is a crime, and we don't care what sort of historic social norms are. This is a crime. This is broken state law, and we're going to charge it.
At the same time, though, it's pretty clear that these kinds of charges are relatively controversial. And John, you talked about your experience embedding with the DA's office in Michigan, of the prosecutor who brought these charges against these parents who were ultimately convicted, that decision on her part to bring these charges in the first place, that was controversial. And also, as you said, that people who are gun owners might have a sense of, look, just because I have guns in my house doesn't mean that I am a criminal if I happen to have kids and if my kid does something horrible. Can you talk a little bit about some of the pushback against this, some of the fears about why these kinds of charges against parents could be dangerous or harmful?
So after the Michigan convictions, there was a lot of concern that that precedent, that law enforcement might take that precedent, prosecutors might take that precedent and use it against families of color disproportionately. They might say, go to areas where maybe a child got access to a gun, and maybe they'll say, well, now we have this precedent, right? We can use this, we can leverage it in a way to get at people maybe that they wouldn't have before. That was certainly a concern that people expressed. They also expressed just sort of a broader concern about this idea of parental responsibility, which has been a debate in America for over a century, about how much should parents be held accountable for what their children do, period, whether it's with a gun or not. Certainly the prosecutor in Michigan, her argument was that she was not holding the parents responsible for what their kid did. She was holding them responsible for what they did. They bought their son a gun. They took him to a gun range. They were given a final chance to intervene. And they're in this room with him, with counselors. They never say, hey, we just bought him a gun. We should look in his backpack. They never say that. They walk out. They leave the school, and hours later, he opened fires, right? And, the day before that shooting, the mom had been alerted to the fact that he'd been looking up ammunition in school. And she texts him about it and says, I'm not mad at you. You have to learn not to get caught.
Wow.
So that's Karen McDonald's argument in Michigan, is that I'm not charging them for what their kid did. I'm charging them for what they did. I think overwhelmingly people supported those charges, those convictions. There have been criticisms, but the same is true in Georgia. You have not seen people taking to the streets. You haven't seen the NRA issuing statements denouncing those charges. You've not seen some sort of groundswell among gun owners saying, we take issue with this.
Yeah. I think what's so interesting about this moment is that I think the inclination of a lot of parents is to have empathy for the parent of someone who does something so horrible, and a sense that parents are, understandably, it's difficult for them to fathom that their kid is capable of something so terrible, and that it would be hard to anticipate or expect that your child could have a plan in mind that's so evil. At the same time, though, I think what you're seeing is in these details of what happened in Michigan and what happened in Georgia, and the ways that parents did have information that was really important, that if they'd been able to piece together would have saved lives, that some of those details are so galling that it seems like people are getting past the sense of, well, no parent can imagine their kid doing something like this, to actually this parent should have been able to imagine it.
Yeah, and we used to hear that at these press conferences, is they've been through enough. That was always the terminology. They've been through enough.
That the parents have been through enough. That this is a literal nightmare.
The parents of the shooter, they've experienced enough already. They've suffered enough. We built a database of school shootings, and it dates back to 1999, the Columbine shooting in 1999. And in that period, we know that at least 195 school shootings have been committed by children, which means they got access to a gun that theoretically they should not have had access to. Just 11 times in that entire time have the adults been charged with any crime because they didn't lock up that gun. Most of those 11 have occurred just in the last few years. So we have seen this sort of exponential increase, but even with the increase, it's rare.
So just talk to me briefly about how this case is going to unfold going forward, and also what's at stake here in terms of whether or not this father is ultimately convicted.
So we really don't know how long this is going to take. We don't know if the father would consider a plea. We don't know if this will ultimately go to trial. A savvy defense attorney will try to take advantage of the fact that there is not really a precedent for, especially for the murder charges. So this could take a while. I think the stakes are not dissimilar to the stakes in Michigan. So the difference, I think, in Georgia is where it is. The Michigan case was prosecuted in a left-leaning county, a largely blue county. The prosecutor is a Democrat, outspoken liberal. That is not the case here, right? In Barrow County, 7 in 10 voters supported Donald Trump. In 2020, this is a place where, in a state with much looser gun laws, and in a county that is very pro-Second Amendment. So I think the precedent and the stakes here have more to do with if you're a prosecutor in Kentucky, in Alabama, maybe in parts of the Midwest, who has a sort of a similarly political landscape. If they don't get convictions here, then I think there would be a chilling effect on prosecutors in those sorts of communities making this same sort of effort.
John, thank you so much for these insights. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
John Woodrow Cox is a reporter at The Post covering gun violence. On Post Reports, we've covered a lot of horrific school shootings, and it's never easy to make sense of. So often we ask, what could have stopped something like this? And I wanted to point to some of our extraordinary reporting last year about the role schools play in trying to prevent gun violence. It's a 3-part series called Surviving to Graduation. And it's an intimate look at how one school district in Virginia grappled with this question over the course of a school year, how teachers and counselors and a principal got involved with the hard and messy day-to-day work of combating gun violence. We'll link to the series in our show notes. Thanks for listening to that story. Before you go, I want to share with you 2 quick updates, both about stories that you would have heard here on Post Reports in the last few weeks. First, Venezuela, where there has been a crushing setback for the country's opposition movement. Edmundo Gonzalez, who was the likely winner of the presidential election back in July, he has now fled the country. Venezuela is controlled by an authoritarian government led by Nicolas Maduro. Gonzalez ran against him in the election, and Gonzalez appeared to win in a landslide victory. But Maduro's government has refused to acknowledge that they lost. They've resisted international calls for a transition of power. So when a court threatened to arrest Gonzalez last week, he fled to Spain. Now there are more questions about whether there is any immediate future for democracy in Venezuela. And
just a beautiful sight as Starliner makes its way to the sands of New Mexico.
Late Saturday night, the Boeing Starliner landed safely back on Earth, but without any astronauts on board. This was the end of a flawed 3-month mission that forced NASA to make an extraordinary decision, choosing to keep a pair of astronauts in space rather than fly them home in the Starliner, which they worried wasn't safe after a rough launch. But it turned out that the capsule did just fine. You might call it a "we told you so" moment for Boeing, which argued vehemently that the Starliner was safe.
And really just a flawless and beautiful descent of Starliner today. I even heard some cheers and clapping in the background.
With the Starliner back on ground, NASA and Boeing will begin what they've said would be a thorough review of what was one of the most tense and controversial human spaceflight missions in NASA's recent history. That's it for today's Post Reports. This episode was produced by Ariel Plotnick, with help from Rennie Svirnovsky, Sabby Robinson, and Alana Gordon. It was mixed by Sean Carter and edited by Rena Flores. Thanks also to Peter Walston. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.